My name is Thomas Hargrove. I am 64 years old, and 9 days ago, I sat in the second pew of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Harwick, Vermont, and watched four men carry my only son out in a pine casket. Marcus was 38 years old. He coached Little League on Saturday mornings. He knew the name of every worker at the mill and their children's birthdays. He had my father's jawline and his grandfather's hands wide, capable, built for honest work. The doctor at Rutland Regional called it a hiking accident. A fall from the Catamount Ridge Trail, they said. Blunt force trauma to the head. Tragic, they said. Unpredictable. I nodded at all of it. I thanked the sheriff. I thanked the medical examiner. I shook the hands of every neighbor and colleague who filed through our house for 3 days carrying casseroles and flower arrangements, and the particular kind of helpless sympathy that good people offer when they have nothing else to give. What I didn't do was cry. Not in front of anyone. 50 years in the timber business will teach you that. You learn to hold the weight of things quietly, the same way old growth holds the weight of winter still, patient, roots going deeper than anyone can see. My daughter-in-law found me in the kitchen after the last guest left. The house was finally quiet. I was standing at the window looking out at the back field, at the tree line where the mill property began, 260 acres of Vermont hardwood that my grandfather had cleared by hand and that my father had turned into a working lumber operation and that I had spent 4 decades building into something that mattered. Her name is Nicole. She is 34 years old and she had been married to my son for 6 years. I heard her come in. I heard the sound of ice in a glass. And then I heard a voice that wasn't hers. I turned around. Standing next to my daughter-in-law, in my kitchen, on the night of my son's funeral reception, was a man I had never seen inside this house before. He was perhaps 40, dark blazer, the kind of easy smile that men practice in mirrors. He was holding a glass of my bourbon like he had been here 100 times. "Thomas," my daughter-in-law said. She didn't call me Dad. She had called me Dad for 6 years, and she didn't call me Dad that night. "This is Brandon. He's been helping me work through some things." I looked at Brandon. I looked at her. I said nothing. She set her glass down on the counter. "Marcus handled things carefully. Thomas," she said. "He wanted to make sure I was protected." She reached into the bag on the bar stool beside her and placed a folder on the counter between us. "He updated his estate documents last year. The mill, the property, the house. He transferred everything into a joint revocable trust, with me as the surviving trustee." I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. "I want to be fair about this," she continued. "I'm not asking you to leave immediately. You can have 30 days to make other arrangements. Brandon knows a real estate attorney who can help facilitate the transition of the business assets. We've already had some preliminary conversations with a development group out of Burlington. They're very interested in the acreage." "Development," I said. It was the only word I could find. "The timber operation is dated, Thomas." Brandon's voice was smooth, practiced. "A modern mixed-use residential development on this land would generate significant returns. Nicole would be well provided for. Everyone would come out ahead." I looked at my daughter-in-law. I looked at the man standing in my kitchen with a glass of my bourbon on the day of my son's funeral. And I felt something I recognized from a long time ago. A cold, deep stillness that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with clarity. I picked up the folder. I looked at the documents inside. I saw Marcus's signature at the bottom of several pages. Something about it bothered me immediately. Something I couldn't name yet. A wrongness in the angle of the letters that I filed away quietly in the back of my mind. I set the folder back down. 30 days, I said. My voice was flat and mild. My daughter-in-law blinked. She had been expecting something else. Anger, maybe. Argument. The broken old man routine. She got none of it. "That's very reasonable," I said. "I appreciate you giving me the time." Brandon smiled and touched her elbow. "See?" he said quietly. "I told you he'd understand." I walked out of my own kitchen. I walked down the hall to the mudroom, put on my barn coat, and went outside into the cold November air. I stood on the porch and looked at the tree line and breathed. My son had been dead for 9 days, and something was wrong. I drove to Burlington the next morning before anyone was awake. Not to a shelter, not to a motel. I drove 45 minutes south to an office building on Cherry Street with a green awning and a brass plate on the door that read Ellison, Wakefield and Associates, Family Law and Estate Planning, established 1971. Walter Ellison was 71 years old and had been my family's attorney since my father hired him as a young associate in 1982. He had drafted every legal document this family had ever signed. He had set up the original corporate structure for the mill. He had written my father's will and then my mother's. He had been at Marcus's christening. He was also the kind of man who arrived at his office at 7 in the morning and always had the good coffee ready. He stood up when I walked in. He came around his desk and put both hands on my shoulders and looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Sit down, Tom. Tell me everything." I told him about the folder, the documents, Brandon, the development group from Burlington, the 30 days. Walter listened without interrupting. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him, and he wrote things down in his precise, small handwriting as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You said Marcus's signature looked wrong to you." I said yes. "Can you describe it?" I thought about it. Marcus signed his name with a slight left lean. Always had, since he was a kid. His father, his grandfather, same lean. Something our family does. The signature on those documents was perfectly upright. Walter picked up his pen. He wrote something down. Then he looked at me over his glasses. "Tom," he said, "I need you to listen to me carefully. When Marcus came to me 18 months ago to update his estate documents, we spent 3 sessions working through exactly how he wanted to structure things. He was very specific. He did not set up a joint revocable trust with Nicole as surviving trustee. What he set up was a family business trust, a separate entity that holds the mill operation and all the real property. Marcus was the managing trustee. You are the successor trustee." I sat very still. "The house is titled differently," Walter continued, "but the mill, the equipment, the timber acreage, the logging roads, the mineral rights your grandfather reserved in 1958, none of that can be transferred by a surviving spouse without the consent of the successor trustee, which is you, and which no one, as far as I am aware, ever asked you to provide." So the documents she showed me, Walter's voice was careful and level. If Marcus truly did execute a separate document last year transferring those assets, he would have needed to do so through this office or through another attorney, and I would have been notified. I have not been notified, and the signature you described does not match any document that left this office. He let that sit for a moment. "Tom," Walter said, "someone created a false document. Someone who did not know exactly how Marcus had actually set things up. Someone who did not know you were the successor trustee. Someone who thought they could wave papers at a grieving old man and walk away with 260 acres of prime Vermont hardwood." I looked out the window at the empty street below. A delivery truck was idling at the corner, steam coming off a grate. An ordinary Tuesday morning, in a city where nothing dramatic was happening. "How much is the land worth?" I asked. Walter set his pen down. "At current timber value alone," he said, "the standing hardwood inventory is worth approximately $3 million. With development potential, and this land does have development potential. Tom, I won't mislead you, you're looking at somewhere between 4 and 5 million. I thought about Brandon's easy smile, his glass of bourbon, his voice saying everyone would come out ahead. "Walter," I said, "Marcus didn't fall." Walter looked at me. "My son ran Catamount Ridge 50 times. He knew every rock on that trail. He trained for an ultramarathon last spring. He doesn't fall." Walter was very still. "What are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to pull every document Marcus actually signed through this office and have a forensic examiner look at the signature on those papers she gave me. And I'm asking you to find out who Brandon is, his full name, what he does, how long he's known my daughter-in-law." Walter picked his pen back up. He wrote something down. Then he looked at me. "Go back to the house, Tom," he said. "Be quiet. Be cooperative. Let 30 days feel like 30 days. And then come back here on Friday." I drove back to Harwick. I packed a bag, the smallest one I owned, and I put it in the truck. I told my daughter-in-law I'd found a place in town to stay while I got my affairs in order. She looked relieved. Brandon, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, gave me a sympathetic nod. I thanked them both for their patience. I got in my truck, and I drove away from the house my grandfather built without looking back in the mirror, because I already knew what I was coming back for. On Friday, I sat across from Walter Ellison in his corner office and listened to what his people had found in 4 days. First, the signature. Walter had engaged the forensic document examiner his firm used for contested estate work. Her conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on the documents my daughter-in-law had presented was not executed by Marcus Hargrove. The ink distribution, the pen pressure patterns, the baseline angle, all of it was inconsistent with Marcus's authenticated signature on file. Someone had practiced his signature and traced it. Someone who had access to documents he had actually signed. Someone who lived with him. Second, the Hargrove Family Business Trust was exactly what Walter had described. Ironclad. 260 acres, the mill, the equipment, all of it. My daughter-in-law had no claim to any of it. Third, Brandon. His full name was Brandon Mercer. He was 38 years old, and he had known my daughter-in-law for at least 3 years, according to their social media history, which Walter's paralegal had been thorough enough to archive before anything could be deleted. He was not a real estate consultant. He was a licensed insurance broker with a firm based in Montpelier. He had written a $2 million life insurance policy on my son 14 months ago. I sat with that for a long time. Who requested the policy? I said. Walter was quiet for a moment. The beneficiary is Nicole, he said. The request came through Brandon Mercer's firm. Marcus signed the application, but Tom and here, Walter paused in the careful way that men do when they are about to say something that cannot be unsaid. The application was submitted 11 months before Marcus died, and the policy had a suicide exclusion that expired after 12 months. The trail. My son's hiking accident on a trail he had run dozens of times. On a Sunday morning when my daughter-in-law had driven to Burlington for what she told people was a yoga retreat. On a morning when Brandon Mercer's cell phone, according to the location data Walter's investigator had obtained, pinged a tower 3 miles from Catamount Ridge. My hands were flat on Walter's desk. I could feel my own heartbeat. He didn't fall, I said again. Tom. Walter's voice was steady and deliberate. The Vermont State Police closed this as an accidental death. If we want to change that, we need to bring what we have to the right people carefully and correctly, not loudly, not publicly, and not before I've made some calls. What calls? The state's attorney's office, and someone I know at the State Police Cold Case Unit, a lieutenant who owes this firm a professional courtesy. This is not the moment for noise. This is the moment for precision. I looked at this man who had known my family for 40 years, who had written my father's will and my son's estate documents, who was sitting across from me with a legal pad full of careful notes and the particular grave focus of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Walter, I said, I've trusted your judgment since you were a young man sitting across from my father in this same office. He nodded. Then go back to wherever you're staying and let me work. I spent 10 days in a rented room above a hardware store on Main Street in Harwick. I read. I took long walks on flat roads, nothing with elevation. I called my daughter-in-law twice to give the impression of a man quietly organizing a dignified exit. She was gracious, cooperative. She even offered to give me more time if I needed it. I thanked her and told her 30 days was fine. Meanwhile, my daughter-in-law was talking to anyone who would listen. She gave a tearful interview to the Harwick Gazette about adjusting to widowhood. She posted on her social media about healing and new chapters. Brandon appeared in several of these posts, always at a respectful distance, always with the expression of a supportive friend. The local sympathy leaned in her direction. Of course it did. She was young and she had lost her husband, and she was beautiful in her grief. And I was the father-in-law, the old man in the background, the one who was apparently fighting her over property at the worst possible time. I let them say it. I let the narrative run its course. Because while it was running, Walter's investigator was pulling threads. He found the receipts first. Over a period of 8 months, Brandon Mercer had made 7 purchases from a medical supply company based in New Hampshire. 3 of those purchases were magnesium supplements and basic first aid supplies. The other 4 were not. They were bulk orders of a compound used in pharmaceutical research, one that, in sufficient doses administered over time, caused symptoms including muscle weakness, impaired coordination, and acute confusion. He found the text messages second, not from my daughter-in-law's phone, which was new and carefully curated, from a backup account on an old tablet, one that Brandon had apparently forgotten he was still logged into on a device he'd left at the house the day after the funeral, and that my neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Evelyn, who had known Marcus since he was 6 years old, had quietly set aside for me when she found it under the couch cushions during the cleanup. I called Evelyn from my rented room on a Wednesday morning and asked her if she still had it. She said she'd been waiting for me to ask. I brought it to Walter that afternoon without turning it on. We handed it directly to his contact at the state police. The messages on that tablet described, in plain language, a plan that had been 2 years in the making. Messages in which my daughter-in-law discussed my son's increasing fatigue and clumsiness over the previous months, symptoms she had attributed to work stress when anyone asked. Messages in which Brandon told her to be patient, that it would look accidental, that the timing needed to be right. Messages in which the two of them calculated, explicitly and in writing, exactly how much they stood to gain once Marcus was gone. $4 million in property, $2 million in life insurance. A fresh start somewhere warm. The Vermont State Police executed a search warrant on the Harwick house on a Thursday morning. I was not there. I heard about it from Evelyn, who watched from her kitchen window as 3 state police vehicles turned up the gravel drive and parked behind my daughter-in-law's Subaru. She called me while it was still happening. "Tom," she said, her voice tight with a feeling that was not quite glee and not quite horror. "There are officers going in and out of the house. Your daughter-in-law is standing on the porch talking to a detective. She paused. "Tom, they're putting her in handcuffs." "Thank you, Evelyn," I said. "I appreciate you watching. Are you coming home?" "Soon," I said. "Not yet." My daughter-in-law made bail by the following morning. Brandon Mercer, who had been picked up at his office in Montpelier, did not make bail. He had also, in the days between the first search warrant and his arrest, attempted to transfer the life insurance claim to a personal account and withdraw the proceeds before the policy was frozen. That particular detail did not help his case. The fraud and forgery charges came first. The murder investigation moved more slowly, the way murder investigations always do when they require the state to re-examine a death that was already ruled accidental. The medical examiner's office requested a second autopsy. The toxicology panel was expanded. Evelyn turned over 2 other items she had quietly set aside from the house. A set of protein powder containers that belonged to Marcus, which he kept on the kitchen counter, and which, the laboratory later confirmed, had been adulterated with the same compound Brandon had been purchasing. My son had been poisoned for months, his balance degrading, his reflexes dulling, his body being quietly prepared for a fall that was supposed to look like no one's fault. In the meantime, my daughter-in-law hired a publicist. I am not making that up. A publicist who released a statement to local media describing her as a grieving widow being persecuted by a vindictive father-in-law who had never accepted her into the family, and who was now using his wealth and legal connections to manufacture a criminal case against her rather than allow her to move forward with her life. The statement was carefully worded. It was also, I noticed, read very carefully by the state's attorney, who later told Walter that it contained 3 factual claims that the prosecution intended to directly contradict at trial. Walter called me the afternoon the statement was released. I was sitting in my rented room reading a book. He told me the statement had been picked up by 2 news aggregators and that there might be some local interest. "What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. "Not one word publicly. Not to the paper, not to anyone at church, not to neighbors. Let her talk. Let Brandon talk. Every word they say on record is a gift. Do you understand?" I understood. The state's attorney filed murder charges on a cold morning in February. I was at Walter's office when we watched the announcement live-streamed on his computer. The same reporter who had interviewed my daughter-in-law 3 weeks earlier now stood outside the Washington County Courthouse, describing the arrest of Nicole Hargrove, charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy in the death of her husband Marcus Hargrove, and the simultaneous arraignment of Brandon Mercer on the same charges, plus insurance fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. My daughter-in-law appeared on camera briefly as she was escorted into the building. She looked nothing like the composed young widow who had handed me a folder in my kitchen on the night of Marcus's reception. She looked frightened. She looked small. She looked like someone who had spent 2 years calculating everything and had failed to account for one essential variable. She had not accounted for an old man who knew how to wait. The trial lasted 3 weeks. It was covered by the Burlington Free Press and 2 regional television stations, both of which discovered quickly that the evidence the prosecution had assembled was not the kind that left much room for reasonable doubt. The compound in the protein powder, the purchase records, the location data, the text messages, which the defense attempted to characterize as private role-play between 2 adults who had been inappropriately close but had never acted on anything. A characterization the jury clearly found unconvincing, given that the messages included specific references to the Catamount Ridge Trail, the weather forecast for that Sunday morning, and a discussion of which of Brandon's hiking boots would leave the least distinctive prints. The insurance policy, the timeline, the forged documents, and the testimony of Walter Ellison, who had spent 40 years protecting the legal interests of my family and who sat in the witness box for 2 hours and methodically dismantled every claim my daughter-in-law's defense team put forward about the nature of Marcus's estate intentions. Brandon's defense attorney tried the same approach they always try. He blamed me, the wealthy father-in-law who had never liked his son's wife, the powerful old man with the lawyers and the resources to manufacture a case, the patriarch who couldn't accept that his son had grown up and made his own choices. The prosecutor asked Brandon, on cross-examination, to explain why his cell phone was 3 miles from Catamount Ridge at 7:40 in the morning on a Sunday when he claimed to have been home alone in Montpelier. Brandon said there must be an error. The prosecutor showed the jury the cell tower data. It showed no error. She also asked him about the hiking boot purchases. He said he liked hiking. She introduced the sales receipt, which was dated 4 days before Marcus died, and the boots, which had never been worn again after that Sunday. The soles matched a partial print recovered from the trail. I sat in the gallery every day of the trial. I did not look at my daughter-in-law often, but on the day they read the verdict, I watched her face. The jury had been out for 11 hours. When they filed back in the foreperson, a retired high school principal from Bahrain held the verdict form with both hands and read it in a voice that didn't waver. Guilty of first-degree murder, both of them. Guilty of criminal conspiracy, guilty of insurance fraud, document forgery, and conspiracy to commit grand larceny. My daughter-in-law's face went absolutely still. The kind of stillness that isn't composure, but the absence of it, the face of someone whose entire internal architecture has just collapsed. Brandon's reaction was different. He stood up. His attorney grabbed his arm. He said something I couldn't hear from the gallery. The officers moved in. He said it louder. He was looking directly at me. "This isn't over," he said. I could read it on his lips, even without hearing it. "This isn't over, old man." I held his gaze. I didn't look away. I didn't say anything, because it was over. It had been over the moment he sat down in my kitchen with my bourbon and told a 64-year-old timberman to clear out his things in 30 days. The sentence came at the following week's hearing. The judge was thorough, and she was not gentle. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For both of them, the insurance company recovered its payout. The forged documents were formally voided. The Hargrove Family Business Trust stood exactly as Marcus had intended it to stand, with me as successor, trustee, and everything inside it exactly where it belonged. I didn't go back to the house right away. I wasn't ready. I drove instead to the mill, to the machine shed in the back, where my grandfather's original equipment still sat in the corner, covered with a tarp, beside the newer machinery my father had added, and beside the equipment I had installed myself over the past 3 decades. I stood in the cold shed and looked at all of it, at a century of this family's work stacked and organized and present. Marcus had walked these floors since before he could read. He had run these machines. He had known every board foot of standing timber on this property by heart. I stood there for a long time. I talked to him the way I had been talking to my wife since she passed 7 years ago, in the particular quiet language of people who have run out of the words that fit. Then I drove back to the house. Evelyn was waiting on her porch across the road. She waved. I waved back. I stood in the kitchen and looked out the window at the tree line and asked Marcus out loud what I should do now, the same way I used to ask his mother. And then, because I already knew the answer, I went to my desk. The next morning I called Walter. "I want to establish a conservation easement on the timber acreage," I said. Walter was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant decision, Tom." "I know it is. The standing timber inventory is worth $3 million. I don't need $3 million. I never did. Marcus never did. That's what those two people could never understand. This land was never about the money." Walter said nothing. He knew me well enough to let me finish. "I want to preserve it," I said. "The hardwood stands, the ridgeline, the watershed on the north parcel. No development, no condos, no resort hotel. The land stays the way my grandfather found it, except for the sustainable harvest operation, which I intend to continue for as long as I'm able to run it." Walter said he would begin drafting the easement documents. "And one more thing," I said. "I want to set up a fund in Marcus's name, a vocational scholarship for young people in Vermont who want to go into the trades, timber, construction, millwork, but can't afford the training programs or the apprenticeship fees. Kids who are good with their hands and don't have anyone to give them a start." "How many recipients per year?" Walter asked. I thought about it. 4, I said. One for each of the 4 counties where our family has operated. We'll call it the Marcus Hargrove Trades Scholarship. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Marcus would have liked that." "I know," I said. "I know he would have." Nicole will spend the rest of her life in a state correctional facility in Vermont. Brandon Mercer will spend the rest of his in the same system. The insurance company filed civil claims against both of them and will spend the next several decades collecting on a judgment that neither of them will ever be able to satisfy. The development group from Burlington, upon learning that the property was legally untouchable and tied up in a criminal prosecution, withdrew their offer without comment. The Hargrove Family Business Trust stands. The easement is being drafted. The scholarship fund will award its first 4 recipients in the spring. My son is gone. There is no verdict in any courtroom that changes that. No legal victory that fills the space where he used to be. I know that. I have always known it. The grief doesn't go anywhere. It just settles differently over time, redistributing itself into the corners of ordinary days the way old snow settles into the hollows of a field. But this is what I can tell you from 64 years of living and 40 years of working, land that was given to me in trust by the people who came before me. There are people in this world who look at what other people have built and see only its dollar value. They see acreage and they calculate return on investment. They see a family and they calculate its points of vulnerability. They look at a man in his 60s who has just lost his son and they see a soft target. They are almost always wrong. The land teaches you something if you work it long enough. It teaches you that what is rooted will outlast what is opportunistic. Every invasive species eventually runs up against the thing it tried to displace. The deep-rooted stands, the original growth, the ground that was there before anyone arrived with plans. I'm still here. The mill is still running. The hardwoods on the North Ridge will outlive me and my grandchildren and my grandchildren's grandchildren. And every spring, 4 young people who are good with their hands and have something to prove will receive a letter that carries my son's name. That is how you answer greed. Not with noise, not with rage, with patience, with roots that go deeper than anyone bothered to measure, with the quiet knowledge that you were here first and that you will be here last. I want to ask you something before you go. Have you ever had someone look at what you'd built, what you'd worked your whole life for, and decide it was theirs to take? Have you ever had to be silent when every part of you wanted to speak? Have you ever lost someone and then had to fight for their memory at the same time you were trying to grieve them? Tell me your story in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from. Your stories remind me that none of us are carrying this alone. And if you believe that patience is its own kind of strength, that truth has a longer reach than greed, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. There are more of these stories to tell. Stories of ordinary people who held on when everything told them to let go. Stories of roots that ran deeper than anyone expected. I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere.